Just hearing the word bureaucracy probably makes you think of long lines, paperwork, and some person in a cubicle telling you you're missing the right form. Full disclosure, it's also one of those impossible to get right without spell check words. Or is that just me? Anything associated with the word was given a bad rap. Senator Eugene McCarthy once quipped that the only thing that saves us from the bureaucracy is its inefficiency. Ronald Reagan piled on, saying, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." George H.W. Bush added his own spin, warning that when Congress passes laws mandating Americans to dance to the tune of arbitrary social and economic goals, it leaves the details of this choreography to the bureaucracy. This is not right. The bureaucracy is not accountable in the same way as a legislature should be, or a president should be. Do a cursory Google search, and you'll find an overabundance of skeptical, sarcastic, and downright hostile remarks on the role of bureaucracy in governance. But respected scholars on the subject have written that bureaucracy is essential, that it exists because we want complex things done in a complex society, and we need a mechanism for that. Bureaucracy is not just a nuisance, it's a necessity. What matters is how well it is designed and how accountable it remains. Bureaucracy is the machine we build to get stuff done at scale. At its core, it's a structure with rules, with roles, with a hierarchy, and it's intentionally impersonal. It's supposed to treat everyone the same, regardless of who you are and who you know. You can think of it as a system of administration. And like any system, it's only as good or bad as the people who run it and the rules that guide it. Sociologist Max Weber gave us a guide for how modern bureaucracy should function. His 5 principles sound simple, but they shape everything: hierarchy, specialization, explicit rules, impersonality, and merit. Each one is designed to keep the system efficient, predictable, and fair, at least in theory. Hierarchy is your basic chain of command. You know who reports to whom and who's got the final say. Specialization means everyone's got a lane, specific tasks, clear roles. Everybody can't do everything. So this cuts down confusion and boosts productivity. And then there are explicit rules. These aren't suggestions. They're written down, standardized, and meant to be followed. The same way impersonality dictates that personal relationships shouldn't sway how decisions are made. That's the goal anyway. And merit means you're hired and promoted based on what you know and how well you do the job, not based on who you know and how long you've been around. Now, based on these principles, it's important to understand that they don't just apply to government organizations. Bureaucracies are everywhere. You encounter them every day. You're probably part of several. Remember, a bureaucracy is a system of administration. That could mean the Department of Justice, sure, but it could also mean the retail outlet you work for, the school district you went to, or the church you worship at. These principles apply universally. The early bureaucracy in the United States was a mess of patronage. It was inefficient and dangerous. You had customs officers who knew nothing about tariffs, postmasters who couldn't read, and Indian Affairs agents who used their posts to line their own pockets instead of honoring treaties. When political loyalty mattered more than competence, it was the public that paid the price. If you backed the right politician, you got a government job. Your qualifications were your loyalty to and ability to transact with power. This was the spoils system. It wasn't until the Pendleton Act of 1883 that policymakers decided enough was enough and put in place merit-based hiring and protections from being fired just for political reasons. Enough was enough because literally a president of the United States was assassinated based on this old system. Look it up. That shift gave us something called neutral competence. The idea that government workers should be professionals, not political cronies.
The Pendleton Civil Service Act was aimed at eliminating the rampant corruption in the federal government of the late 1800s. It addressed a method that had been developed to finance costly political campaigns called the spoils system.
Jackson is said to introduce the spoils system, although certainly there was nothing new about politicians appointing their friends and supporters to office. But the phrase comes from William Marcy, a Jacksonian leader in New York, "To the victor belongs the spoils." And what that meant was that when the president comes in, he can kick out all the office holders and appoint his own.
Make a contribution during the campaign, and you could essentially buy a federal job for yourself or for a family member.
They used public office as a way of building up the political party in a much more effective and full way than previous politicians had done.
This practice diluted the federal bureaucracy. Politicians wrangled over who would get these patronage jobs, and appointees were often unqualified or incompetent. In 1881, when President James Garfield, an advocate of reform, was assassinated by a man who'd failed to get a patronage job, there were calls for change. In January 1883, Congress finally passed the Pendleton Act, named for its Democratic Senate sponsor, George Pendleton. It established a civil service commission to make sure that federal employees were hired based on merit rather than on political connections. The Pendleton Act required job applicants to pass competitive exams to obtain certain jobs. By 1897, it covered 86,000 jobs, or almost half of all federal workers. The act resulted in a more competent government workforce, but it had the unintended consequence of leading the political parties to rely more heavily than ever on contributions from business interests to fund their campaigns, an issue that remains at the forefront of politics today.
Plot twist. The U.S. Constitution doesn't actually mention the bureaucracy. Not once. And yet bureaucrats have enormous power. They're unelected, they're hard to fire, and often operate behind the scenes. That makes accountability a big issue. We're talking about people who write the rules, enforce them, and interpret them, often without much public attention. For example, think about the IRS agent who decides whether your tax deduction counts, or the FDA official deciding whether a new drug can hit the market. These aren't elected officials, but their choices affect your wallet, health, and future. So keeping that kind of power in check requires clearly written laws and procedures that tell us whether someone is doing their job or abusing it. In the end, it's not elections that keep bureaucrats accountable. It's the rules. The clearer they are, the harder it is to hide behind. Think of the federal bureaucracy like a big tree with 4 major branches. You've got cabinet-level departments, independent agencies, regulatory agencies, and government corporations. Each one plays a different role, but all of them exists to administer, enforce, and sometimes even create public policy. Understanding how they're structured tells you a lot about how power flows. Some agencies answer directly to the president. Others operate with major independence. Some are focused on regulation, others on administration. and a few function almost like private businesses. But they all share one thing: they carry out the law.
There are two kinds of federal employees. The first group are merit-based career positions. These jobs tend to be experts, administrators, and support staff that do the important work of keeping the government running. It could be an engineer at NASA, a nurse at the VA, or a railroad safety inspector at the Department of Transportation. Workers like that have robust employee protections, meaning they can't be fired for political reasons because their jobs aren't political. That way, they can work over many administrations, gaining the kind of extensive experience that the government needs to function. The second group consists of political appointees like cabinet secretaries and those under them. They are hired by a new administration to ensure the campaign promises of the new president are being worked on, and they tend to leave when that administration does. There are about 2 million career federal employees and only about 4,000 political ones who change depending on who is in charge. Those are the ones the new administrations do have to hire.
Cabinet departments are the heavyweights, like the Department of Defense or Department of Education. They're created by Congress to oversee broad areas of national interest and are led by secretaries who report directly to the president. These departments are massive. They're broken into sub-agencies and rely on federal appropriations for funding. They're answerable to both the president and Congress. Independent agencies are still created by Congress, but are intentionally insulated from presidential control. Agencies like the Federal Reserve fall into this category. They're typically run by commissions or boards with fixed terms, and their leaders can't be fired only for cause. That means they've got a layer of protection, but they still answer to Congress. Regulatory agencies police. Agencies like the FDA or the SEC create rules that have the force of law, often with big consequences for violations. They were created by Congress to protect the public interest and are run by independent boards. Their independence allows them to operate without direct presidential interference, but with plenty of oversight from lawmakers. Government corporations are weird hybrids like Amtrak or the U.S. Postal Service, which operate like businesses. They charge for services, they have CEOs, and they're supposed to be self-sustaining, but they're still government-owned. That means they walk a tightrope, needing to stay competitive while also serving the public. Congress still calls the shots on big-picture governance, but these entities often run day-to-day without much interference. Bureaucrats can wear 3 hats: administrator, rulemaker, and judge. In other words, they implement the law, they interpret it, and sometimes they even settle disputes about it. That's a lot of power for folks you didn't vote for, and it's why understanding how this system works is so important. First, let's talk about the role of administrator. Bureaucrats are tasked with carrying out laws passed by Congress, even when those laws are vague and overly broad, and they often are. Bureaucrats have to interpret what the law is trying to do and then turn it into action. But recently, this role has been under attack, especially by the courts. The Supreme Court's decision to overturn what's called Chevron deference has thrown a wrench into how agencies interpret unclear laws.
A very big decision from the Supreme Court overturning Chevron NRDC. For that, we'll turn to Eamon Javers. Hey, Eamon.
Carl, that's right. This is a sweeping decision by the Supreme Court to overturn what's called the Chevron precedent here. The reason it's significant is because it has enormous implications for the administrative state in the United States of America and all federal agencies and their ability to interpret the law. What the Chevron precedent was a 1984 case from the Supreme Court which held that in absence of other information, courts should give deference to administrative agencies' interpretation of the law. That gave a huge area of wiggle room for federal agencies to interpret what Congress meant when it passed given laws, if there was any gray area in those laws. What the Supreme Court is now saying this morning in a 6-3 decision is that courts may not defer to an agency interpretation of the law simply because a statute is ambiguous Chevron, they say, is overruled. Again, that is a 6-3 decision. One interesting point here, going back to the Chevron case originally in 1984, the Supreme Court writes, Chevron decided in 1984 by a bare quorum of 6 justices triggered a marked departure from the traditional judicial approach of independently examining each statute to determine its meaning. So some skepticism here of whether that case was originally decided correctly. The Supreme Court now saying it was not. Chevron is overturned, and there's going to be enormous questions now, Carl, for administrative agencies across the federal government as to how they move forward with interpreting rules when there is a gray area in the law. A lot of uncertainty now for federal agencies. Carl, back over to you.
Yeah, and Eamon, is the idea that they would have to continually check back with Congress, or is it just up to Congress to kind of micro-legislate all of these elements?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're going through this decision here this morning, and we're going to see if the Supreme Court is giving any guidance here. But I mean, one option would be that Congress has to go in a detailed way and detail all the stuff that regulatory agencies have been doing between 1984 and until today. Another option would be that the federal agencies would get some deference unless there was a lawsuit challenging that. We'll have to see what the Supreme Court said. There's a lot of fallout here still to come, but Chevron being overturned is a significant development we should pay some attention to this morning.
When the law is silent on the details, bureaucrats step in to fill the gaps. This is called bureaucratic discretion. They use their judgment to figure out how best to implement what lawmakers intended. So, for example, if a law says a factory must reduce emissions but doesn't spell out how much or by when, it's up to the EPA to write the rules. That's rulemaking in action. And bureaucrats at the street level have similar abilities. Think of a teacher or a social worker or a police officer. They make these kinds of discretionary decisions every single day. Bureaucrats also act as judges. When someone breaks the rules an agency has written, it's often the agency itself that determines the penalty. Think about immigration judges. They decide whether someone qualifies for asylum or should be deported. These decisions aren't made in a traditional courtroom, but they carry enormous weight.
The Department of Justice has now fired multiple immigration judges, according to 2 sources. This comes as the immigration case backlog reaches a record high for a 3rd year in a row. A union says 5 mid-level judges and 13 judge candidates were let go. Since the Trump administration took office, more than 24 immigration judges and officials have been fired. So far, the DOJ and DHS have not commented.
Street-level bureaucrats are the ones you actually see. These are the government workers who carry out policy face-to-face with the public. They are the person processing SNAP benefits, the housing inspector walking through your apartment complex, the officer writing a ticket, and the person talking to you right now. These folks aren't setting the policy, but they are the ones shaping how it's applied. Take the city worker who issues zoning permits. They decide if your business plan complies with the rules or not. They enforce building codes, approve construction plans, and ensure public safety. It's real power that can make or break your ability to operate legally in a given space. Or think about a firefighter. They don't just put out fires. They inspect buildings for compliance. They enforce safety protocols, and they make real-time decisions in emergency scenarios that carry legal and financial consequences. Street-level bureaucrats blend policy enforcement with on-the-ground discretion every day. They all rely on discretion. That's the key word. Whether you're getting your driver's license renewed or applying for disability benefits, it's a street-level bureaucrat who interprets the rules and applies them to your situation. How strict or lenient they are can make a big difference in your experience and in your outcome. Bureaucracy isn't just a Washington, D.C. thing, or even an Austin thing. It's everywhere, federal, state, and local. From the Department of Veterans Affairs to your city's sanitation department. Bureaucratic positions span across every level of government. That's millions of public servants running everything from Medicare to the local DMV. At this point, you might be thinking bureaucracy is all structure and no soul. But every system has a culture, and the culture of a bureaucracy shapes how it works day to day. We're talking norms, values, habits, the unwritten rules that govern behavior even when the policy manual says something else. Why did the new recruit soldier have their head shaped? Why are the bosses insisting on team building exercises? Why did the old G-men have a uniform look? What's the blue wall of silence or the purpose of those endless training videos for orientation? Culture. That's what's doing the work behind the scenes. It sets the tone for how everything runs and how everyone behaves. Bureaucratic culture is about internal commitment, a deep buy-in to mission, process, and professional standards. It can be good, like when disaster responders snap into action because they're trained for it, or bad, like when people become so attached to doing things the way we've always done it that they block innovation. Bureaucratic culture can prevent disaster. That's a big strain. I mean, with air traffic control, nuclear energy, or emergency medical services, you want people there to follow procedure. You want consistency, and you want expert coordination. But it can also stifle innovation. Departments might hoard information, resist collaboration, or confuse outsiders with overly rigid protocols. The same habits that protect us can also hold us back. Author Frank Herbert lamented, "Bureaucracy destroys initiative. There is little that bureaucrats hate more than innovation, especially innovation that produces better results than the old routines. Improvements always make those at the top of a heap look inept. Who enjoys appearing inept?" Risk aversion is a chief trait. Bureaucracies are built to avoid scandal. Taking risks isn't rewarded. In fact, it's discouraged. No one wants to be the one whose decision made headlines. And that's why whistleblowers, the people who speak up, are often treated as threats, not heroes. Whistleblowers are those rare individuals who put their careers on the line to expose wrongdoing. Whether it's corruption or mismanagement or abuse of power, they speak out, often at great personal cost. They force accountability when the internal systems have failed. Jeffrey Wigand was a tobacco executive who exposed how cigarette companies manipulated nicotine levels. Edward Snowden revealed the scope of the NSA surveillance of American citizens. Daniel Ellsberg was a military analyst who leaked the Pentagon Papers and changed public perception of the Vietnam War. And FBI official Mark Felt became, quote, deep throat and helped expose the Watergate scandal. These are case studies on the costs of challenging powerful institutions.
With all the talk of a whistleblower in Washington in the past few days, what does that exactly mean? It's defined as an employee who brings wrongdoing by an employer or other employees to the attention of a government or law enforcement agency, and who was commonly vested by statute with rights and remedies for retaliation. In this broad category of people, one of the most famous in American history, Mark Felt, better known as Deep Throat. The FBI informant helped take down the Nixon administration, divulging crucial information about Watergate. And in 1971, military analyst Daniel Ellsberg leaked top-secret Department of Defense information about why the U.S. entered the Vietnam War. William Binney and Thomas Drake were NSA officials who informed the Inspector General about government surveillance programs they perceived as invading citizens' privacy by monitoring their internet activity. FBI agent Colleen Rowley flagged then FBI Director Robert Mueller about intelligence failures before the 9/11 attacks. Or Sergeant Joseph Darby, who told military investigators in 2004 about inmate abuse at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Not everyone who blew the whistle on the government has been rewarded. For some, it meant the end of their careers, or even worse.
Winter's willful, purposeful disclosure caused exceptionally grave damage to U.S. national security.
Former NSA contractor Reality Winter leaked a secret report about Russian hacking of the 2016 election to a news organization. Now she's serving a sentence of more than 5 years after pleading guilty to leaking that classified information to the media.
Winter will serve a term of incarceration that will give pause to others who are entrusted with our country's sensitive national security information.
The Air Force veteran's mother telling CNN in March she's being painted as evil.
I think that we as Americans deserved that proof. And so how is it that she put us in danger by giving us that proof?
Winter's the first person arrested under the Trump administration using the Espionage Act, established in 1917 during World War I, originally intended to prosecute anyone interfering in U.S. war efforts. So people like spies. In modern times, it's the same law that sent Edward Snowden into exile in Russia. The former intelligence contractor accused of leaking NSA documents revealing a secret global surveillance program.
These leaks have inflamed and sensationalized for ignoble purposes the work that intelligence community does lawfully under strict oversight and compliance.
Earlier this month, Snowden said he'd like to return to the U.S. if he's guaranteed a fair trial.
I'm not asking for a parade. I'm not asking for a pardon. I'm not asking for a pass. What I'm asking for is a fair trial. And this is the bottom line that any American should require.
And in May, the Justice Department indicting WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange of 18 Espionage Act counts, ordering him extradited to the U.S. after spending 7 years at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Assange charged with conspiring to help former intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning, who spent 2 separate terms behind bars in connection with leaking secret Defense Department documents in 2010, published to WikiLeaks' website. President Obama commuted her sentence, and she was released in 2017. Manning telling CNN in May she has no regrets.
I did what I did with the information that I had, the knowledge that I had, and the tools and resources that I had at the time. In 2010, when all this happened, it was a very different, landscape.
The risks are serious. Whistleblowers can lose their jobs, struggle to find new ones, and face legal or personal retaliation. Their relationships suffer, their finances suffer, and their reputations can be dragged through the mud. Some never work in their field again. To blow the whistle is to make a big personal sacrifice. There are arguments on both sides. Supporters of whistleblower protections argue that exposing wrongdoing is a public good, that without insiders willing to speak up, corruption and abuse go unchecked. Whistleblowers help shine light where something sketchy has been deliberately hidden. On the other hand, critics argue that some disclosures can harm national security, damage government operations, or unfairly malign organizations without proper context. They say loyalty and internal channels should come first. So should whistleblowers be protected, even if what they reveal embarrasses or disrupts the system? Do we value truth and transparency, or do we prioritize loyalty to the institution? That tension is at the heart of this entire conversation. Corruption in bureaucracy isn't always a bribe in an envelope. It's where power is misused to serve private interests instead of the public good. It erodes trust, fuels inequality, and lets the powerful play by different rules. Author Philip K. Howard put it like this. He said, Plato argued that good people do not need laws to tell them to act responsibly, while bad people will always find a way around law. By pretending that procedure will get rid of corruption, we have succeeded only in humiliating honest people and provided a cover of darkness and complexity for the bad people. There is a scandal here, but it's not the result of venal bureaucrats. In other words, rules alone aren't enough. Systems built solely on procedure can become playgrounds for the unethical, while honest actors get silenced and exploited. One common type of corruption is the revolving door, when officials bounce between industry and government. Regulate a company one year, work for them the next. It creates cozy relationships that can undermine public interest. If you know your next paycheck is coming from the very company you're supposed to regulate, how tough are you really going to be on them?
The 60 Minutes Washington Post investigation of the opioid epidemic exposed the role played by former drug regulators who went to work for the drug industry. We asked Juliana Goldman to take us through the revolving door.
During the Obama administration, some drug enforcement officials began running into roadblocks in their efforts to combat the opioid epidemic. Why?
Some of the best and brightest former DEA attorneys are now on the other side and know all of the weak points.
Former DEA attorney Jonathan Novak told 60 Minutes and the Washington Post that former agency lawyers now working for industry were pressuring their old colleagues. As a result, DEA enforcement action slowed. Among other things, 60 Minutes found 46 people who went from the DEA into drug industry roles, including lobbying.
It is indeed time to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
Special interests are part of the fabric of Washington. And despite Donald Trump's campaign promise, the revolving door between government and industry keeps on spinning. His frontrunner to be Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, is a former pharmaceutical executive. Mr. Trump's nominee to serve as a top bank regulator, Joseph Otting, used to be a bank CEO. And while Otting awaits confirmation, Keith Noreika, who represented banks at his former law firm, is filling in. But he's designated a special government employee, exempting him from President Trump's executive order restricting lobbyists who join the administration from working on anything they lobbied for 2 years. But that rule hasn't stopped the president from nominating a coal lobbyist as second in command at the Environmental Protection Agency, where the agency's administrator, Scott Pruitt, has already begun rolling back Obama-era coal regulations. When he was Oklahoma's attorney general, Pruitt joined industry groups to sue the EPA more than a dozen times.
We're seeing the total corporate takeover of the U.S. government on a scale that we have never seen in American history.
Robert Weissman is the president of the watchdog group Public Citizen, which has found that nearly 70% of Mr. Trump's picks for top administration jobs have corporate ties.
You could say that the corporate foxes have knocked down the hen house and are gobbling up the chickens.
The EPA President Trump has also nominated a former consultant for chemical companies to lead an office that reviews chemicals, and an energy industry attorney to lead the Office of Air and Radiation. A Senate committee is scheduled to meet on those nominations next week. Anthony?
The revolving door is still going round and round. Juliana Goldman, thanks.
Regulatory capture happens when the regulator becomes more loyal to the industry than to the public. The classic modern example is the FAA's relationship with Boeing during the 737 MAX crisis. When agencies cozy up to the people they're supposed to oversee, accountability breaks down. Public safety takes a backseat to industry profits. And it ain't just with airplanes. Take the opioid epidemic. Purdue Pharma, backed by the Sackler family, aggressively marketed OxyContin as a safe painkiller and captured regulatory favor to do it. Through lobbying and influence over FDA language and relationships with oversight agencies, they downplayed the risks of addiction and flooded communities with pills. Regulators were effectively helping push the product to unsuspecting patients. That's regulatory capture, and the consequences have been devastating.
It's a concept called regulatory capture. And so the way, and this has happened many times for, hundreds of years. This is like a very well-established kind of thing in economics and politics. So suppose you're a big bank, suppose you're Jamie Dimon, you run JP Morgan Chase, like what's like the biggest possible threat of what you could possibly face? It's that there's some disruptive change that comes along that upends your entire business. You're Kodak. You're making a ton of money on analog film, and then digital cameras come along and you get destroyed. And in your obituary, it's like you're the idiot.
Blockbuster Video.
Like that's the cautionary tale. Those are the ghost stories that those guys tell around the campfire at night.
Right.
They're just absolutely terrifying.
Right.
And like business schools teach you, like that's the one thing you do want to do. And so there's two ways to try to deal with that. One is you could try to invent the future before it happens to you, but that's hard because you're running a big company and these startups are out there doing all these crazy things, and can you really do that? And it's hard and frisky and dangerous. The other thing you can do is you can go to the government and you can basically say, okay, we would like to propose basically a trade, which is we would like the government to put up a wall of regulation, right? We would like the government to put in place rules, right, that are potentially thousands of pages long, right? And in fact, the more the better.
With all this power and potential for corruption, who watches the watchers? Oversight is the process by which agencies get held accountable by Congress, the courts, the public, and even within the executive branch. Oversight is essential. It's how we make sure agencies aren't just following the law, but doing so in a way that reflects democratic values. Congress has a few tools in its oversight toolkit. It can hold hearings, investigate misconduct, and even threaten to cut funding if agencies aren't complying. This is one of the most important and underappreciated ways Congress wields power. Writing the law is only part of the job. Making sure it's followed as intended is where oversight kicks in. There are two main styles of congressional oversight: police patrols and fire alarm. Police patrol oversight is proactive, constantly checking for problems, scanning the system for abuse. But it's time-consuming, and because of that, rare. Members of Congress usually have other more pressing priorities. That is, until there's a high-profile, politically ripe scandal, whistleblower complaint, or public outcry. Fire alarm oversight is totally reactive and kicks in when members of Congress rush to microphones or to television screens and oversight hearings to cue the public and be seen doing the work of scrutinizing unelected bureaucrats. Sometimes oversight becomes performative, a chance for grandstanding, not genuine accountability. A member of Congress yelling at a bureaucrat on live TV might get applause, might get attention, might get fundraising. But whether it leads to better policy is debatable. Oversight can certainly expose problems or just create a spectacle.
For more than 4 hours, Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheadle faced an avalanche of attacks from both Republicans and Democrats in Congress.
Well, look, I believe, Director Cheadle, that you should resign.
Not only should you resign, if you refuse to do so, President Biden needs to fire you.
Cheadle, forced to appear by subpoena, attempted to take the blame for the security lapses that led to the attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump.
We must learn what happened, and I will move heaven and earth to ensure that an incident like July 13th does not happen again.
But instead, she left many members of Congress frustrated.
You're full of today. You're just being completely dishonest.
Pressing for answers.
Was there ever a moment where the Secret Service actually considered pausing the rally?
the Secret Service would have paused the rally had they known or been.
So the answer is
there
no.
was an actual threat.
The answer is no. Correct?
I can speak to you in generalities.
No, I don't want generalities. I want specifics.
Unable to answer basic questions, like when the gunman got on the roof and what he had with him.
Was the gun already on the roof, or did the shooter carry the gun up with him?
I do not have that information at this time.
NBC News has reported that the Secret Service turned down a request by the Trump team for more security assets. Cheadle responded to the report only by saying there were no additional asks for the July 13th rally. But her inability to provide any explanation for what went wrong led to a rare bipartisan call at the end of the hearing from Ranking Member Jamie Raskin and Chairman James Comer for her to resign.
This relationship is irretrievable at this point.
A call Cheadle refused to entertain even as she left the hearing room. It's bipartisan calls now for you to step down, ma'am. Will you take those calls to heart? And the House is set this week to vote on the authorization of a bipartisan task force specifically aimed at the investigation into the assassination attempt and propose reforms to prevent it from happening again.
Citizens have tools too. Advisory councils allow public voices to weigh in on agency decisions. Sunshine laws open meetings and records to the public. The Freedom of Information Act gives citizens the right to access government documents. The Privacy Act lets people see what data the government keeps on them. These are all forms of decentralized oversight, ways the public can pull back the curtain. Before agencies finalize major rules, they're required to open them up for public input. This is called the notice and comment process. It gives individuals, businesses, interest groups, and advocates a chance to weigh in. Think of it as a feedback loop baked into the rulemaking process. It's a way to democratize bureaucracy, at least in theory.
In the U.S., after Congress passes legislation like the Food Safety Modernization Act of 2011, also known as FSMA, the president signs it into law. But things don't always change immediately, and for good reason. A law like this takes time to implement. Under FSMA, it's up to the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, to create rules to implement the law and make expectations clear. Thankfully, the notice and comment rulemaking process is open and provides the opportunity for the public to participate. Here's how it works. First, the FDA issues a proposed rule, which is published in the Federal Register and available on regulations.gov, so individuals, companies, and government officials worldwide can review it and send comments, typically over 30 to 90 days. This means anyone can have a say. Next, a final rule is published, along with responses to significant comments and any revisions. But even then, the final rule is not enforceable until its effective date, which gives companies time to comply with new requirements, and maybe 6 months or even years into the future. A final rule might also provide additional time for small companies. To help everyone understand and comply with a rule, FDA might also provide non-binding recommendations called guidance, which represents FDA's current thinking on a topic. Through this open rulemaking process, FDA can create rules that account for complex needs and focus on FDA's primary goal, protecting public health.
If you're tempted to think that public feedback doesn't matter, think again. Major policies from net neutrality to environmental rules have been shaped by the public comments submitted during this phase. Sometimes agencies ignore them. That's real. But a flood of well-argued, well-documented comments can shift the direction of a proposed rule. It's not fast, and it's not always satisfying, but it is one of the few mechanisms where your voice can enter the federal policymaking process, even if you never run for office. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, "If you have contempt for government, you will get contemptible government." And nowhere is that more obvious than in how we treat and design our bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is often the target of scorn and derision, but it's also the backbone of modern government. It interprets the law, implements policy, enforces rules, and shapes your daily life in ways you probably don't even notice. It's not just about red tape or forms or acronyms. It's about power, quiet power, unelected institutional power, power that can be used to serve or abused to shield. That's why design matters, and oversight matters, and public participation matters. If you take nothing else from this, remember that bureaucracy is people, people trained into a system, people shaped by a culture, people making choices every day, sometimes within tight constraints, sometimes with startling discretion. We don't pay attention to how power works, it gets away from us. But if we stay involved, we can make sure the system actually works for people.